you give a warm welcome to Mark Whitacre. Mark.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and it's great to be here today and to share. And I had a chance to share with Toolbox downtown yesterday, and going to be sharing at a group like this in Austin tomorrow for Toolbox. And just thank you for being here. Just thank you for the opportunity to be a share. And I'm getting to know Tom and Toolbox a lot better. And what a great ministry. What a great ministry. And I wish I would have had that in my 20s and 30s. Maybe it would have changed the journey that I went on, because it's been an interesting journey the last several years, last 3 decades. But I want to start off when I was 32 years of age. That was 5 years ago, by the way. When I was that was 33 years ago. I'm 65 now, so I'm a lot closer to the end of my life, than I am the beginning. And God's put on my heart to really be a witness for Him and really share taking a life from ashes to beauty, because He definitely took a life that I took. Wasn't it God's fault? I'm the one that took it to ashes. But He sure brought it back out of the ashes and brought it to beauty for both my wife and I and our 3 children. And I think when at the end of this day, you're going to say, how did his wife stay with him? Boy, I get asked often. It's a miracle of God that my wife would stay with me. I met Ginger when we were in 7th and 8th grade. We grew up in a little town north of Cincinnati. Yes, we're Bengal fans. And yes, we went to Ohio State, and we're Ohio State fans. And so we grew up in this little town, 1,000-people town called Mar, Ohio, north of Cincinnati, about an hour. And we met in 7th and 8th grade. I would say at that time in my life, I had the right moral compass. I wouldn't have stolen an apple from a neighbor during that part of my life. So I had great parents, Christian parents that forced me to go to church. I really wouldn't learn anything there, but they were forcing me to go to church. And I was senior class president of my class. My wife and I were the homecoming king and queen. So we were doing, the right things during that part of our lives. And then when I started college, I had a full scholarship. I was the only child out of four children in our family. And I was the only child to go to college. I was actually the only child to go to college and prison in my family. I was the only one that went to college. I had a full scholarship for 8 years straight. Went to Ohio State University and got my bachelor's and master's. Was really strong in the sciences. Full scholarship, academic scholarship. Got a Ph.D. from an Ivy League University in Chemistry from Cornell in New York. So I was 22 years old, a PhD student at Cornell. The average age is 32 for a PhD student. So I was about 10 years younger than the others. And I studied hard, worked hard. Again, still had the right moral compass at that point. Graduated when I was 25 years old in biochemistry. I remember some of the PhD students said, I graduated in 83 from Cornell. And 83 is when the whole biotech industry was exploding. Genentech was starting, and Hop on the Road was starting new divisions, and the whole pharmaceutical and biotech industry was just exploding in the 80s. So the job opportunities were remarkable. I mean, we bought our first home right when I started a job with Ralston Prina, now owned by Nestle's. It was my first job in St. Louis, Missouri. We bought our first home, had a company car. And we bought our first washer and dryer. We were going to laundromats when we were in college prior to that. So it was amazing, the life change. And I would say at that point, I probably started looking at, in college, I was looking at it more, how can you make the world a better place? But I would think at that point, I kind of started looking at myself. Kind of an example of selfish leadership. Hey, I can make a lot of money doing this. I'm glad I got a PhD biochemist. I'm going to become a millionaire at a fairly young age, being a PhD biochemist from Cornell. So that's where I was when I graduated at 25. A couple years with Ralston Prina, one of the suppliers that was supplying some of the amino acids and vitamins, because they have breakfast cereals, pet foods, and so on. Like I said, they're owned by Nestle's now. And one of the suppliers hired me. I speak fluent German. I learned German when I was at Cornell, and they fluent German, so they offered me a job, and it was a job with a lot higher salary. I was 2 years out of college, so you're looking to kind of move up the corporate ladder. So I took this job. I was 2 years in New York with them, and then being fluent in German, they moved us over to Frankfurt, Germany for 4 years, at the world headquarters for 4 years. So I was about 6 years with them. And I was vice president in Germany, responsible for acquisitions, mergers, joint ventures, especially a lot of the technology side of the business, building new plants. Degussa is one of the largest chemical companies in Germany. Right after BASF would be the second largest chemical company in Germany. So that's who I worked for. So at that point, in Germany, I was doing joint ventures and acquisitions. And one of the companies I was working with, a company called ADM, Archer Daniels Midland. And I was meeting with a 75-year-old CEO. And we were looking at ways, can everybody hear me okay? And we were looking at ways to do joint ventures together, build a plant in Europe and Asia. And the CEO of ADM, he was really impressed with some of the things we're doing technology-wise, the patents that we had, and all the scientists that we had. We had dozens of PhD scientists at Degussa. We had about 40,000 employees there. So he asked me one day, he said, Mark, we're doing this for a couple years. It seems like there's a lot of bureaucracy here. Why don't we just do this together, but without Degussa? Why don't you just come work for us? And I kind of went on, so I'm 6 years here at Degussa. I got guys that are mentoring me, pouring into my life. I was on the right moral compass at that point in my life. And I was 32 at this point when this conversation was happening, so I was about 7 years out of college. And I said, I just can't imagine leaving Degussa. 6 years here, I'll go back to the U.S. They're talking about me being the U.S. president. So Degussa's North America president. I was vice president in the world headquarters in Germany. They wanted an American, but spoke fluent German, had some experience at their world headquarters. So that's kind of what they were grooming me to be, the president of the North America Degussa. That's what the plan is. And he said, well, what do you earn? And at that point, this is before euros. And I told him, I said, well, it's Deutschmarks. And I told him the exchange rate was about 3 to 1 at that time. And I said it'd be close to about 400,000 US dollars. But 400,000 US dollars don't go near as far in Europe as it does here in the US. But that's what the exchange rate. He said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you about almost tenfold. I'll give you a $350,000 base salary. And my total with bonuses and stock options and everything was about $400,000 at that time. He said, I'll give you a $350,000 base salary, but I'll give you a contract with very attainable performance parameters. And if you meet these performance parameters of the division that I'm going to put you over, the biotech division, it'll be $3 million a year. Wow. And I just spent an hour telling him all the reasons I wouldn't leave. And I said, where do I sign? So I signed that, signed a contract. Employee contract, become divisional president of the biotech division of ADM. ADM is one of the largest fermentation biotech companies in the world. Ethanol, world's largest ethanol producer. Products like high fructose corn syrup, lactic acid, citric acid. ADM is number 50, at that time, 1989, 56 on the Fortune 500, 70 billion in revenue at that time, and 30,000 employees. So one of the largest companies in the world. So I was going to be divisional president of the company and corporate vice president of the whole company. And hear this clearly. The CEO was 75 years old. The president was 69. He said, Mark, you're going to be our number 4 ranked executive. And I was 32. And there were 79 or 75 and 69. So I thought, well, boy, a few years, I can even be the next COO or CEO. So I was obsessed with that opportunity and couldn't wait to join the company, and came home and told my wife in Frankfurt, said, honey, we're moving to Decatur, Illinois. She said, what? Where? We've been here 4 years. What are we moving there for? And I said, well, I took a new job. I'm going to be divisional president of the 56th largest company on the Fortune 500. She said, you didn't do it for the money, did you? I said, no, it's a great job. So amazing thing is we moved to Decatur, and I moved a couple months before them to let our kids finish Frankfurt, Germany in December. So I moved October of '89. Moved there. The CEO, 75-year-old, came back to my office. He took me out to our airport a couple miles from there, and he said, Mark, this Falcon 50 is we have 7 jets for our 7 top executives. You're our number 4 ranked executive, being vice president of the company and divisional president of the biotech division. And he signed me 2 pilots, and I had a Falcon 50 my first week. And I was there for 8 years. I tell you what, I thought I was Bon Jovi. Had my own jet, had blonde hair blowing in the wind back then. I wasn't bald, 32 years of age. 3 weeks working there. 3 weeks working there, the CEO said, you move your family from Germany yet? Said, no, we're looking at homes. My wife can't really move over to December anyway. This still would have been late October at that point. He said, why don't you buy my home? I said, well, share me a little bit about your home. He said, well, it's 13,000 square feet, 8-car garage, horse riding stables where your kids ride in an inside arena during the wintertime. That way in Decatur, Illinois, they're warm in an inside arena. Living quarters in the horse barn. Security guard living quarters if you want security guards there. 8-sided family room by the pool that was a couple thousand square feet, wasn't even attached to the house, by the swimming pool. 3 golf greens. So I'm hearing all this, and I'm thinking, I can't afford this house. He said he lived in it for about 30 years. He said the founder of Archer Daniels Midland, John Daniels, lived in the house for 30 or 40 years before that. And I thought, boy, you live in that house, you're going to be the next CEO. I better find a way to buy that house. So I said, I don't think I can afford that house. He gave me a startup bonus. By the way, it's my 3rd week working there. A startup bonus for the down payment. He said, I own most of the banks in this area. He said, I'll give you a startup bonus. We should have went to prison for that. Some of the things that happened there, being a publicly traded company. So I bought his home my 3rd week, this mansion, 8-car garage, horse riding stables, golf greens. I mean, it was a home that Bill Gates would live in. It was a home that looks a lot like this. And so that was my home. I lived in there for 8 years and had that jet for 8 years. I tell you, the best way to probably describe this is I was Justin Bieber before Justin Bieber. And I became obsessed. I became a different person than who I grew up with, my parents. I became a different person than who I was at Cornell. That power and the greed focus and the obsession, almost like an addiction. I mean, that 8-car garage, keep in mind, with my bonuses, I was $250,000 to $300,000 a month. And that's 1989. $3 million a year for 8 years. That 8-car garage, within a year, I filled it up with 8 cars. I had a Ferrari, 2 BMWs, 2 Mercedes. I had a couple $1 million worth of cars. My wife's driving a 10-year-old Jeep Cherokee, a 10-year-old Jeep, and I'm driving a Ferrari. My wife became a Christian age 30, so she's a Christian at this point. I was not. She forced me to go to church, and it was one ear out the other, just like I did with my parents. But I wasn't a Christian at that point. And she said she wanted to be a good steward for God's resources, and I couldn't understand any of that. I just wanted a garage full of 8. I had an 8-car garage. I was going to fill it up with 8 cars. And I said, Ginger, I got a red Ferrari. I'll buy you a yellow one, whatever you want. She said, no, I'm happy with my Jeep, 10 years old. It's only got 40,000 miles on it. I don't need all that stuff like you need. So we were definitely starting to go different paths at that point in our life compared to when we first met and when we first got married, because I was full of narcissism and addiction to greed and power. And keep in mind, I'm working for a president that's almost 70 and a CEO who's 75. And I'm thinking I'm going to be one of those 2 guys in 3, 4, 5 years. So I'm going to go from number 4 executive to number 1 or 2 executive, which is what was on my mind at that point. So now let's fast forward a couple years. Ginger did not like the environment of the company. She did not like who I was becoming. She felt like it was all full of greed. She felt like it was an example of selfish leadership. We were all focused on ourselves, that we didn't focus enough on the 30,000 employees. We didn't focus enough on the community. And I heard that a whole lot from her during these first couple years. So I'm a couple years there now. And the vice chairman comes back to my office, gave me a huge bonus, a check, and another 25,000 shares of stock. And that alone was about $1 million. And it was at a time that where performance wasn't being evaluated. So I thought it was kind of odd he gave me something, but I was so greedy, I wasn't going to chase him down the hall and give it back. And an hour later, he came back to my office, and I knew what it was for. He said, Mark, your family, we trust you. Look how the age we're becoming. Keep in mind now the CEO's 77 and the president's now 71. This is a couple years there. I would have been 34 at this point, 2 years at the company. He said, what we're going to do is that we're going to start training you and equipping you and mentoring you on some things that we've not shared with you. And he started sharing with me a price fixing scheme. He didn't call it price fixing. He didn't call it a cartel. He didn't call it antitrust, breaking antitrust laws. He didn't call it collusion. But that's exactly what it was. Getting together with our competitors, fixing the prices of our ingredients, and basically manipulating the market to earn hundreds of millions of dollars a year extra in profits that made our stock. Our stock was doubling at that time every 3 to 4 years. And a lot of our income's in stock options, so the more faster the stock goes up, the more your income goes up. Because 90% of my income was in stock options and bonuses. So that's why they wanted to drive the stock price up, because their income was the same. And he started sharing it, and I mentioned to him, I said, now that's not legal, is it? He said, Mark, the people that put antitrust laws in the books, these politicians in the 1800s know nothing about business. These laws should not be on the books. You can't be in the commodity business and not be involved with, and not do this. You have to do this. And I knew if I'm going to continue to move up if I didn't do it, my career was ended. So I knew I was going to have to do this and become part of the family and become eventually to take their place and eventually take over this international cartel. So I started being mentored, started to learn about it. When I first came to ADM in '89, there was an FBI agent undercover helping with the Chicago Board of Trade case for ADM, helping ADM, assisting ADM. So we always had, a company that size, you're involved with the FBI. And at this point in time, we had an FBI agent helping with a contamination case in one of our fermentation plants. So we're working with an FBI agent there. And Ginger asked me, this is November 5th, 1992, and about 7 months involved in the price fixing scheme, being mentored to eventually take it over, the international cartel. And like I said, we were earning hundreds of millions, sometimes $1 billion a year, just from the price. Our profit's $4 billion. Sometimes our 25% of that could be from the price fixing part of the case, part of that. So it was a significant part of our overall earnings. So she asked me, she said, Mark, I've known you since you're in the 8th grade. Something's different about you these last few months. And she said, you seem nervous to talk about the FBI. They're helping you with your contamination problem. Why would you be nervous? And I said, Ginger, I'm involved with this huge price fixing case for 7 months. They're training me to eventually take it over. We're earning hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes $1 billion a year doing this. And the FBI, they're helping us on this little tiny thing, but we got this big case going on right under their noses that's much bigger. And she said, really, tell me about that. She never heard of price fixing, she said. She was a stay-at-home mom raising 3 young children. So I shared with her what we're doing, how we're working with our competitors, fixing the prices of ingredients that go into your food and beverages, that would go into everyday foods. When Kellogg pays higher for ingredients, or Pillsbury or Kraft, it doesn't affect their bottom line. They pass it on to the consumer. So the consumer was the one that was paying this hundreds of millions of dollars. So I described that to her. And she was really troubled by this. And then she asked the question that I wish she wouldn't ask. She said, Mark, is this legal? And I said, it's not legal, but everybody does it. You can't be in the commodity business if you don't do this. I told her the same thing that I was told. And I said, if I'm going to move up the corporate ladder, I'm going to have to do this. She said, Mark, you're involved with a fraud. I can't believe you would do this. You went 8 years of college. You're wonderful parents. You had such a good track at Degussa. Why would you get involved with this? I said, Ginger, if I'm going to move up the corporate ladder, we live in a mansion, we're flying around on a jet, our kids are in private schools. If I'm going to continue this for our family, this is what I got to do. She said, you know what, Mark? I'd rather have a 2,000 square foot house, a Ford in the driveway, and have my husband back. She said, that's what I'd rather have. She said, all this stuff doesn't mean anything to me, she said, anything to her. So I shared with her, what was going on. And then she said, who pays this extra hundreds of millions of dollars a year the company's earning through this scheme, this price fixing scheme? And I said, the consumers pay it. She said, you mean my grandma on $200 a week, Social Security is paying this? And we live in a mansion with an 8-car garage and flying around on a corporate jet? She said, Mark, I don't know if I can live with this. She said, I'd rather be homeless than live in a house where illegal activity is occurring. I mean, she was just adamant about it. And then she told me she was going to, again, she's a Christian 4 years by this point. She involved with her church, involved with 2 Bible study groups, 2 women's groups. And she was quiet time, a couple hours in the morning. So, she was really, and I liked her being obsessed with that because it allowed me to do more work, because a lot of my work is based on performance. So it allowed me to work and be a workaholic because I knew my wife was busy. She was busy with Jesus, and I was busy about making as much money as I could and to get as many cars in that garage as I could get. And so she said she was going to pray about it. When she told me she was going to pray about it, I knew I was in trouble. She went for about an hour and a half in her study, prayed about it, and she came out. She said, Mark, God led me to a decision. I said, well, good, I got to get back to a lot of our price fixing was with companies in Southeast Asia. So 8 o'clock at night in Decatur, Illinois is 8 o'clock in the morning in Southeast Asia. I got to get back on my price fixing calls. I'm thinking. And she said, you won't be making any calls today. She said, I've made a decision. Mark, you're working with the FBI. They're helping you on this one small case. And you got this huge multi-billion-dollar fraud right under their nose. She said, you're turning yourself into the FBI today or I'm doing it for you. I said, Ginger, I could go to prison for breaking antitrust laws for price fixing. It's a federal offense. And I said, the CEO is a billionaire. He's best friends with President Clinton. He owns 5% of a $70 billion company, the largest single shareholder, the 77-year-old CEO, who I reported to. I said, he will destroy us. He went to President Nixon's funeral, I told Ginger, on President Clinton's plane, and he's on the phone with President Clinton a couple times a month. They will destroy us. This is the 56th largest company in America. They'd be larger than that today. I think they're number 40 or 42 today, so they're even larger today, ADM is. Great company, 30,000 hardworking people. So I don't want this to reflect on the company. It was just 4 bad apples at the top, and I was one of those bad apples. It was just poor leadership. So it wasn't a bad company. Similar to Enron and WorldCom, great companies, but had some bad leadership. And I was one of those leaders. So I want to make that clear. It's nothing to do with ADM. It's about 4 greedy top leaders of the company. So I said, Ginger, they'll destroy us. She said, you know what, Mark? My CEO's bigger than your CEO. And I said, Ginger, you haven't worked for years. Who's your CEO? She said, my CEO is Jesus. Amen. And I said, Ginger, our CEO lives 7 miles down the road, and they're going to destroy us. She said, God will protect us. We're going to do it today. I've already put some things in motion, and it's going to happen today. Well, I don't know how many of you ever been in front of the FBI and told them you're stealing $1 billion a year, but I can tell you it's an interesting reaction. This reached Janet Reno, the Attorney General, William Sessions, the Director of the FBI. This became the largest price-fixing case in U.S. history, started by a stay-at-home mom raising 3 young kids. So at the end of 4 hours talking with the FBI, I remember telling the FBI, you got all these drug dealers you're working with. I see them on the sidewalk all the time. What Ginger has me here for, it's not worth talking about. All the things you got going on in Decatur and bank robbers and drug dealers. And he said, well, how much money's involved? I said, like I said, all these drug dealers and stuff? I said, you surely got more to do. And Ginger said $1 billion. He said $1 million. She said, no, $1 billion. $1 billion? I said, what are we working on a plant contamination case for them? And then he said, well, how long has it been going on? I said, look at all these drug dealers. I saw even when I was pulling in to the FBI. He said, Ginger said, 12 years. He said, 12 years. So he should have just had the interview with Ginger and left me out of it. He got all the truth out. At the end of those 4 hours, Ginger said, look, my husband did the right thing. He's only involved 7 months. It's been going on for 12 years. We go home now, right? The FBI said, your husband confessed to a crime that's hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes $1 billion a year. I have to arrest him today, or he has to start wearing a wire tomorrow. Well, I sure didn't want to be arrested. 34 years of age, not even 10 years out of college yet, 9 years out of college at Cornell. So I said, I'll wear a wire. That was a choice I had. Met him at 6 in the morning. They said take about 6 weeks wearing a wire. Met him at 6 in the morning. They shaved my chest, put a microphone on my back with an athletic band, 4 different FBI agents. I'd rotate 2, and then the next day another 2, every Monday through Friday. And then they'd have another tape recorder in a briefcase and another tape recorder in a notebook. And I wore a wire, was wired up every Monday through Friday, 10 hours a day for 3 years. 1992 to 1995, from 34 to age 37. It wasn't 6 weeks, it was 3 years. I was falling apart. The FBI would say, Mark, if these guys catch you, they're going to kill you. This is an international cartel involving billions of dollars. I lost 60 pounds wearing a wire. People thought I had cancer. People would say, Mark, you need to see a doctor because something's physically wrong with you. Even that was being wired and taped. So I'm wired. My mom would call, she's taped. My dad would call, she's taped. Someone would come and have lunch with me, they're taped. I'm wired every Monday through Friday for 3 years, like a robot. Go to the bathroom, you're on tape. I mean, it was a horrible experience. I don't recommend it to any of you, by the way. So I did it. Now we're getting close to the end. I want to mention too something about a green lamp. There's a green lamp that the FBI had a video camera in it. And this green lamp was at 2 or 3 meetings a month for 3 years. I would tell the FBI where the meeting's going to be because they knew this was going to be a long trial, one of the biggest companies in the world, 7-week trial. It was in Chicago. So they would get the green lamp in that room and they would be in the next conference room and they could control through a monitor and zoom that green lamp, whoever was talking, to capture everything in that meeting. And that video camera, that same green lamp, was at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore. $1,000, it looked like a place like this. The lamp looked like it came from a yard sale. A couple weeks later, it was at the Mandarin Hotel in Hong Kong. Same green lamp, same 11 guys sitting around a table. A couple weeks after that, it was in the Four Seasons Hotel in Chicago. And then Maui, Hawaii. That green lamp was at 2 or 3 meetings a month, 5 feet from the same 11 guys for 3 years. I look back and say, thank God we did not have a woman criminal among us. Because if we had a woman criminal among us, a woman would say, that green lamp is following us around the world. But when you got 11 greedy guys that are seeing millions of dollars of bonuses in their heads that are coming from this price-fixing scheme, they didn't see what was 5 feet from them until a trial in Chicago, 7 weeks long, and then they banged their heads, say, now they remember the green lamp. It was a little late when they wanted to show the jury how they gathered the evidence. I made the audio tapes. The green lamp made the video tapes. So as we get towards the end of the case, the last few months, the FBI say, Mark, we're coming to an end. You're only going to be wearing a wire a few more months. It's going to be over. They had a full immunity agreement signed for me, never to do 1 day in prison. Full immunity because they were so appreciative of me risking my life for them. By the way, there's a documentary on my website with the real 3 FBI agents on markwhitacre.com. And they did that because the FBI felt like the movie didn't capture the seriousness of the case. So they did a documentary to combat the movie. And that's on my website with my wife and I and the 3 real FBI agents. And you watch that and you get a little more about the seriousness about how they felt my life was in danger. So markwhitacre.com homepage under a tab called Investigation Discovery will take you right to their site and show you that documentary. It came a few months out after the movie. And so at that point, full immunity, never to be charged, and all I had to do was stay out of my own way. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. The last few months, I'm thinking, who's going to hire me after wearing a wire for 3 years against my own company? It's easier to get a job as a felon than someone to wear a wire against your own company for 3 years. Who's going to hire me? At that point, I'm only 37 years old by the time I wore a wire 3 years. 12 years out of college, and I looked at that house and those cars. I thought, how am I going to keep this standard of living? I looked at about how much money I had in my account. I looked at the stock price that day. I looked at stock options that I had not cashed yet, not exercised. There was a set of stock options worth about $9 million, but it was about a year away from exercising them. So I was going to be fired once they knew I was a mole. The FBI said, you got to be prepared. They're going to have a tough time keeping you once they learn that you're the informant when this case goes public. So I looked at that and I said, how am I going to get this $9 million? I said, I sure can't tell Ginger. She turned me in again. So I can't tell her. So I thought, well, I said, I'm number 4 executive. The accountants are scared to death of me. Anybody in that company knows that I'm the next COO. It's pretty obvious about the succession plan. It was even in Fortune magazine that I was likely to replace the COO. So the whole company knew about it. I knew they were scared to death of me. So I thought, well, I'll just write checks to myself. And then if it ever went to trial, I got stock options signed by our chairman and CEO that they owe me $9 million. I just cashed it in a year early. So I wrote 5 checks for $9 million, thinking I'm the smartest guy in the room, I thought. Thank God I went to Cornell, I thought. Wrote 5 checks to myself. Thought if they ever, how can the company turn me in? They're stealing $1 billion a year. For 12 years, how could they turn in for $9 million? And if they did, I had the stock options to show that the company was going to owe me that someday, a year later. So the day that ADM learned that I was the mole, that very day, because they had to sign those checks that were $250,000 and above. They would even say a couple times, Mark, you're getting kind of greedy, aren't you? They signed them because I'm involved in a $1 billion crime. They just said, slow down, and don't take so much. But they signed them. So the day they learned I was informant, they made the decision, if I put them in flames on price fixing, they're going to put me in flames on the $9 million. They called the FBI that day, told them about the $9 million. The FBI come to my house. Ginger was there in the room, in the family room. They said, Mark, what about this $9 million? We've been working with you for 3 years. What's going on here? So I tell them about the $9 million. I showed the stock option. They said, Mark, we understand what your thinking is there, but you can't cash stock options in. There's SEC rules and guidelines. You just can't cash them in yourself. You got to wait till the exercise dates. I said, well, it's worth $9 million today, but they said, Mark, it may not be worth that a year from now. It goes by the exercise date. And so they said, you're going to lose your immunity agreement for this, the FBI said. So Ginger was furious to hear that. This is the first she's hearing about the $9 million. She told me divorce wasn't on the table, but murder was. And believe me, that was the time murder was on the table. So I explained it to them. They said, we're going to get you the best deal we can get you, Mark. We understand your logic. You helped us on a multi-billion-dollar fraud over 12 years, so we're going to get you the best deal we can get you. They went to the prosecutor and said, Mark Whitacre helped us on a crime that was going on over a decade, the biggest price-fixing case in history. He stole $9 million at a time that they really would have owed him that a year from now. So they showed the stock options, tried to explain all that. Prosecutor said, we agree. Mark was under a lot of pressure, was not of a clear mind, was blowing the driveway off at 3 in the morning during thunderstorms. Neighbors was telling others that, 3 in the morning during thunderstorms, I'd be blowing the driveway off with a gas leaf blower. I was falling apart during that time. So they were sympathetic. They said the FBI told the prosecutor, said, we should have never taken him undercover for 3 years. We don't even take agents undercover more than a year because they crack under pressure. Here's a guy that's untrained. We made him wear a wire for 3 years. Prosecutor sympathetic gave a 6-month plea agreement, 6 months. And Martha Stewart sentence in federal prison. So I went from immunity, lost that because of the $9 million, then a 6-month sentence for the $9 million. Lawyer called me in Chicago. Mark said, a deal of a lifetime, 6 months in federal prison. 6 months, Mark. You go in at 30, I'm 38 by that point. You go in at 38, you come out at 38. Ginger said, Mark, let's sign it, put it behind us. I looked at Ginger, said, Ginger, this is all your fault. I've had to wear a wire for 3 years for 10 hours a day because of you. I've lost my position at one of the biggest companies in the world, number 4 executive, because of you. I said, I'm going to do the opposite, Ginger, you want me to do. I ripped up the plea agreement, threw it in her face, fired the lawyer on the spot, hired a group of lawyers, fought the case 3 years in the courts, and got 8.5 years instead. And I had a Martha Stewart sentence right in my hand because the FBI was so sympathetic because of all the help that I gave them wearing the wire. I was my own worst enemy every step of the way. Never make these kind of decisions in isolation. Look at the decisions I made, and look how bad these decisions were. I was so depressed at that point, pulled my car in one of the garages, wrote a 17-page letter to Ginger the day before to her and my kids, and I tried to kill myself. I was at the end of myself. I was hopeless and helpless. How am I going to go to prison by that time after fighting in court for 3 years? Keep in mind, this all started when I'm 32. Now I'm 40. Now I'm going to prison at age 40, and I won't get out to 40. And I would have went at age 38 and got out at 38. So I was so depressed, tried to take my own life, hospitalized for a month, treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, and heavily medicated for about a month. Sent home, had 7 months before I had to go to prison. Someone read about it in the newspaper, all the things I just shared with you, and about the suicide attempt and about the 6-month plea agreement, throw it in the trash can. And he showed up, his name was Ian Howes. He was with a group called CBMC, Christian Businessmen Connection. He was CFO of a pharmaceutical company, 5 young kids, school age and younger, and his wife a lawyer. And I never forget, he said, Mark, prison's going to be the beginning of your life, and you're going to find your purpose in your life with the journey you're ready to start. I'm thinking, this is the craziest thing I ever heard. I told my wife that. I said, Ginger, there's somebody on the porch that's crazier than me. She said, that can't be. I said, he said, prison's going to be the beginning of my life, and I'm going to find the purpose in my life with this journey. And she fell to her knees in tears, Ginger did. And she said, thank God, God sent somebody. She said, Mark, I've been praying for you for 10 years. Your parents have been praying for you their whole lives. And you've never listened to us, but God sent somebody to talk to you. And I think to talk sense to you. And I pray you listen to this guy. And she was in tears. So I went out and Ian, I said, Ian, what do you have in mind? He said he had a study called Operation Timothy, and he was going to introduce me to God and introduce me to Jesus. I said, I went to church with my parents. I go to church with my wife. I already go to church. He said, Mark, I'm not talking about going to church. I'm talking about a personal relationship with Jesus, and I'm going to introduce you to him. Amen. And he spent 6-7 hours a week with me, introducing me to Jesus for the 7 months before I went to prison. And for the first time in several years, I started seeing a little bit of hope. I wasn't there yet, but I was starting to have a little bit of hope. My second week in prison, a man named Chuck Colson showed up. I don't know how many of you know him. He was White House counsel for President Nixon. Went to prison in the 70s, became a Christian. His nickname was the Hatchet Man. The director of the FBI, the Attorney General, the White House counsel, 12 of them went to prison. President Nixon was pardoned by President Ford, but the other 12 went to prison. Chuck Colson became a Christian in the 70s. He showed up my second week in prison and started telling me the same things Ian Howes was telling me. How his life was changed. He found his purpose in his life. And I told him about Ian Howes for 7 months. He said, Mark, have you given your life to Jesus? Have you surrendered your life? I said, it's given me hope, Chuck, but I have 8 years of college, including an Ivy League Ph.D., that I had professors say, for 8 years, I never met one Christian Science professor in 8 years. And a few of them said, if you are a Christian, you can't be in my class. If you're a Christian, you can't be a PhD scientist. And I said, I've heard that kind of thing for 8 years, Chuck, between Ohio State and Cornell in the science community. He said, Mark, do you think there's a scientist that believes in God? And I said, absolutely not. He started inundating me and discipling me, showed article after article and book after book of Christians or scientists that are Christians. Even Albert Einstein wrote an article. Albert Einstein said only God could create the universe and only God could create man, and the Big Bang Theory is impossible. I thought, well, Albert Einstein's a pretty smart guy. And I sure never learned that at the university. They hid that from me for 8 years. He showed me a book by Sir Isaac Newton that wrote as much about Jesus as he did about science. I said, they sure never told me that in my 8 years of education. Book after book, article after article over 3 or 4 months' time, and then a book that really hit me. It was a book by an atheist scientist in Minnesota who's still alive today. His name's Don Byerly, B-I-E-R-L-E, Dr. Don Byerly. And this scientist, PhD biologist, so I could understand the language, wanted to prove once and for all God does not exist. He was an atheist. He studied it. He researched it exhaustively. He was obsessed with it. After 10 years of study, it proved to him that God does exist and Jesus is the Son of God. And he wrote a book called Surprised by Faith. I read that book and got down on my knees that day and gave my life to Jesus and said, how can you be a PhD scientist and not believe in God? It was my 3rd month in prison and I gave my life to Jesus, and it changed my life forever. I remember for the first time after years blaming my wife and blaming the FBI and blaming ADM. My wife come to the visit room every weekend with my kids. She did that for 8.5 years. She moved to 3 different states to live next to 3 different prisons. With good behavior, you head to a better prison. I got to do my last 5 years on Pensacola, Florida Navy base. By the way, if you go to prison, that's where you want to go. I can help you get there. And she came every weekend. And for the first time ever that weekend, after I surrendered my life to Jesus, I said, Ginger, and I told my kids, they're all young at that time. Keep in mind, this is 30 years now. I told Ginger, I said, I've got no one to blame but myself. No one put a gun to my head to force me to be part of a price-fixing scheme. Nobody put a gun to my head to write 5 checks for $9 million. I got no one to blame but myself, and my wife had not heard that the entire time. And I apologized to her of everything I put her through. And I said, Ginger, I don't blame you for leaving me if you do leave. She said, Mark, I'm not going to leave you. I've been praying for you for a decade. And she said, there's lots of times I wanted to run, but God told me to stay. And she stayed, and we're married 43 years today. 43 years, and she visited me every weekend for 8.5 years. A miracle of God, our marriage to survive that. If you serve 5 years and longer, the official statistic is in the 90% range. 5 years and longer, 90% range, and we're married for 43 years. A miracle. Our kids are stronger and closer. They're all older than I was even when this case happened. Our youngest is 37 today, actually. turned 37. And keep in mind, I was 34 when I was wearing a wire, 32. So our kids are all older than I was, and they're walking with the Lord. And I tell you, I give my wife credit for that. My wife looks back. She did an interview when the movie came out on CBS News, national news. I was in California doing another interview in 2009 when the movie came out. She was doing an interview, and they asked Ginger on CBS News in New York. They said, how'd you do it? She said the same thing I told you earlier. She said divorce wasn't an option, but murder was. And there were a couple times she wanted to do it. And they asked her when she was most mad. She said the most mad when he took a 6-month plea agreement and I threw it in her face. And said the entire case was her fault. She said, Ginger, what would have happened if your husband, and this was someone in the secular world, this wasn't a Christian asking these questions, but what a great question God led. Said, what would have happened if your husband signed that 6-month plea agreement? She said, I was mad and I wanted to kill him at the time, but I looked back and she said, thank God he didn't sign it. He would have never listened to Ian Howes and Chuck Colson. Thank God he didn't sign the 6-month sentence. He would have came out the same greedy man he went in. And she said, God gave him exactly what he needed, which was 8.5 years in prison. I think 2 years would have been enough. I would have loved to have been on that interview. But I do agree 6 months would have not been. I had to be broken. I had to be the end of myself. And I look back and I thank God for what happened. I thank God for brokenness. And my wife and I, my marriage, if I stayed at ADM, would have not survived. If I got a 6-month sentence, I don't think my marriage would have survived. If I would have had the full immunity that I originally had, I think I would have lost my family. Thank God for brokenness. Thank God for going through the fire. I am so appreciative of that now, 25, 30 years later. 65 years old now. This all happened wearing a wire when I was 34, 31 years ago. So I thank God for that today. The companies that I stole from on the price fixing scheme, Coke and Tyson Foods and Procter & Gamble, they were paid hundreds of millions of dollars back from class action suits. Coca-Cola alone was $400 million paid back. I put an $800,000 whistleblower reward for my wife for her turning me in because they were so appreciative. It was about $100,000 a year while I was in prison to put my kids through college, help her have a small home. The people I stole from took care of my family for 8.5 years. Miracle of God. Miracle of God. The company I work for today, Coca-Cola Consolidated, was a victim of the case. I work for a company I stole from, a user of high fructose corn syrup in beverages. And I work for them today, leading the T-Factor initiative. Coca-Cola Consolidated is a different company than Coca-Cola Atlanta. Coca-Cola Company is the largest bottler, the Consolidated, largest bottler. Different CEO, Frank Harrison, different board, different ownership. We're on the NASDAQ, and Coca-Cola Company in Atlanta is on the New York Stock Exchange. Two different companies, the bottling side and Coca-Cola Company. And we have a purpose statement for 23 years. Our CEO, Frank Harrison, put it in place. Our only purpose is to honor God in all we do by serving others, pursuing excellence, and growing profitably. We are a faith-based, purpose-driven company, and we're a publicly traded company. We have 102 plant sites. We have a chaplain in every plant. Over 100 prayer groups and Bible studies. One prayer call I was on recently, we had 400 people on it. It's about God, God in the center, and about our people, and it's changed our culture in the last 23 years. And I lead that, T-Factor, which stands for transformation. So God gave me a second chance in another large organization, but this time doing it His way and not my way. And I feel so blessed to have a second chance. Even when I got out of prison, I was hired by a biotech company. Started like at age 49, like someone right out of college, cancer research company. I became the COO of that company after 10 years. And I'm still on their advisory board today. And I became the #2 executive after 4 promotions of that company. And we turned that company into a faith-based company. Christian CEO, all about God, God at the center. I think there's no better place for ministry than the marketplace. I stand in front of you here today as a PhD scientist from Cornell University. God does exist and Jesus is the Son of God. And I have zero doubts in my mind. Zero doubts. And I don't live just on faith alone anymore. I've seen the evidence. The evidence that God could turn my life even just from ashes to beauty. That the companies I stole from take care of my family. The companies I stole from, I work for today. I don't take it lightly. second chances do exist. And God is about redemption and second chances. So great to be here today and to share with all of you. Thanks for having me. And God bless all of you. And thank you for allowing me to share. Thank you.